A young boy wakes up from a hard smack to his head. His father looks down with disgust, calling him the family's biggest disgrace. But what nobody knows is that Urian can master every fighting style in the world. Up in the Kingdom of Crisis on the northern border, an army pushes forward. Duke Allen stands in shock, yelling that it's unbelievable. Dead bodies rise from the ground and walk toward them. Allen says there are way more than he imagined, and they're bringing that terrifying, poisonous fog with them. A soldier urgently tells the Duke to look up, and he's stunned. Even Durian, the Death Knight, is among them. Not one of the 10 best knights fighting for the living could promise to beat him. Allen knows with what they have now, they can't win. He suggests falling back to regroup, but Allen shakes his head. They can't retreat because the wall is already damaged, and if the gate falls, their kingdom is finished. Whatever it costs today, they have to hold the line. Then suddenly, something rushes past them. A young man rides across the battlefield with his red cape flowing behind him. Allen asks who's charging forward so recklessly, and a soldier recognizes him. It's their backup from the Southern Rocks family, the only one who fights with daggers. The soldier starts to warn that his opponent is Durian, and a simple dagger could never hurt him. But then the weapon plunges deep into the zombie, cutting completely through the undead's body. Allen watches in amazement while the knight wonders how it's even possible. As Urian keeps throwing his daggers, each one hits the zombies and melts their monstrous forms with just one strike, making people wonder if he's a holy warrior sent from heaven. Urian thinks they're being silly. He just takes anything good for the body and makes it his own. 6 months earlier, the young man suddenly wakes up confused. He looks around, trying to figure out where he is when someone approaches. Urian lifts his head and notices she's pretty attractive, though her clothes look strange and she's carrying a sword. The woman asks how the young master is feeling because she was going to call the priest this time. Urian reaches out, saying he just wants to ask something, but she's already left the room. He gets out of bed, still wondering where he is, then glances to the side and freezes at his reflection. His fat body stares back at him. He wonders what happened to his young, handsome looks and why he turned into this overweight kid. Unable to understand it, he tries to convince himself it's all just a dream. Maybe if he sleeps again, everything will be normal when he wakes up. The priest walks over and says the young master has finally woken up. But then a man bursts into the room, his voice filled with rage as he calls him worthless trash. The disgrace who ruined their family's reputation has finally woken up. The priest quickly steps in, reminding his lord that he just woke up and punishment can wait. The man grumbles, and the priest points out that for someone he beat unconscious, he doesn't look too badly hurt. His mind seems stable and most wounds have healed, which is a relief. But that makes the Lord even angrier. He shouts he'd prefer if the boy had died because he tried to assault his bride-to-be. He's an animal. He's 19 now and needs to grow up. Even his younger brother has awakened his aura, but the older brother is still fat without any energy. Urian repeats this, totally shocked. The Lord turns, warning that once he recovers, he better go beg her for forgiveness. Urian quietly repeats her, and his father snaps that he means his wife Ilya. If she doesn't forgive him, real punishment is coming. He asks if he understands, and the main character quickly agrees. The Lord sighs, adding that he has to stop bringing shame to their family name. Urian trembles with fear as reality sinks in. If this is his identity now, he must be Wellington Rocks. The Lord's head snaps around, shocked at being called by his name. He calls him an insolent brat and slaps him hard across the face for addressing his father by name. The big guy takes hit after hit. The priest tries to calm his lord down, but nothing works. Urian thinks this can't be real. It has to be a nightmare. After passing out and waking up later, he sits up startled. He can't understand why he hasn't woken up in the real world yet. The woman approaches, asking if he's finally awake. Urian calls out Aaron, and she responds but looks confused when he doesn't say anything else. The main character wonders if he's trapped here after bothering Ilya and getting knocked unconscious. Aaron confirms it but questions why he's suddenly talking so formally. Jurgen agrees and asks if he actually got beaten that badly. The woman nods, explaining that he attacked Lady Ilya and she pummeled him until he blacked out. He curses his luck, which confuses the girl as he yells that he's doomed beyond any doubt. Somehow he'd been pulled into the web novel he created, but not as the hero, instead as the worthless villain who humiliates the lead and dies miserably. He complains this can't be his destiny. Aaron calls to her young master, but he keeps panicking, saying this isn't a web novel, a term the woman doesn't recognize. Jurgen thinks the body he's taken over is complete garbage. No talent, no ability, no dedication, surviving only on his family's reputation. He loses his fiancée to the hero, then tries ambushing him for payback but gets thrashed again. He dies pathetically in some nameless alley. Jurgen wonders how he'll make it in such a dangerous world, realizing it's a fantasy setting, and he knows nothing about this fat body's capabilities. But at least he remembers the hidden encounters and items the hero hasn't found yet. So he decides to act fast as he sits up. His poorly balanced, heavy body makes movement awkward. Aaron asks if the young master is okay. Jurgen replies he's definitely not, but then notices something odd. The girl suggests he should rest. He thinks he couldn't see it earlier, which explains his earlier confusion. His system window hovers next to Aaron, displaying her abilities: Swift Sword, Clear Mind Mirror, and Aura Adaptation. She calls to the young master again. Jurgen brushes it off, saying he was confused momentarily but feels fine now and she should return to her work. Aaron agrees and starts leaving while he watches her go. He considers Swift Sword. Originally, Aaron was far stronger and more skilled than ordinary knights, but he wants to understand this affinity stat showing 0. He wonders if this is some dating game feature that appeared because he played too many of those. What kind of world design is this? He briefly considers Jurgen's usual attitude and the non-negative affinity score, but that wasn't what mattered most. Looking at himself in the mirror while waiting for the system window, he shouts excitedly, checking his status screen showing the Eye of Creation skill and 4 heavens of the Tang clan. He realizes he has unique abilities, especially the 4 heavens of the Tang clan skill, from that wuxia web novel he loved because the heroine was stunning. It's the clan famous for poisons and concealed weapons. The world's a mixture, but he decides to be patient because mastering the martial arts of the 4 heavens of the Tang clan would drastically improve his survival odds. This fighting style came from a famous sect in the 4 heavens province in wuxia stories, recognized for deadly poisons and specializing in silent kills. He questions why it exists in what's supposed to be a medieval fantasy setting, but this means he can activate his powers. Wellington approaches his room when Aaron greets her lord. He asks if his son has awakened and the girl confirms. Wellington asks about his condition. Aaron answers he doesn't look fully recovered. He stumbled when trying to get up and his overall state seemed weak. Wellington mentions Father Io said the injury wasn't serious, but his son acted somewhat unusual because normally if told to apologize to Ilya, he would have thrown a fit. Yet now he oddly just complied. His character hasn't shifted. He was simply shocked. Tomorrow he'd likely be enraged, wanting revenge on Ilya. Aaron says her young master will slowly improve. Wellington walks away irritated, leaving the girl startled. He thinks even his own father has abandoned him. But the girl still thought he should feel guilty about her and allow her to pursue her life as a knight, wondering how difficult it was serving under him. But Aaron thinks otherwise because today the young master felt different somehow, though it was difficult to put into words. Earlier, Aaron had shouted asking what he meant. He answered he just wanted to work out a little and she should lead the way. Aaron questioned whether he was seriously going to train now, and Jurgen confirmed, asking what's wrong with that. His creator's eye skill let him view stats, but he had no clue how to activate the Sichuan Tang clan's martial arts. Perhaps his weight was blocking it, so for now he'd just exercise until he figured it out. Jurgen thought this estate was enormous, the size of multiple stadiums, and he was already worn out. But if he tried working out in his room, his body would just drag him back to bed. He absolutely needed to avoid exercising at home. Also, every servant he passed looked at him with complete revulsion. But considering how Jurgen used to act, he couldn't fault them for it. They kept walking, and Jurgen asked if they were getting close. Aaron said they were nearly there. This was the third training center, and most knights trained at the first and second ones. Jurgen suddenly spotted someone ahead. He saw the affinity was -91 with a high chance of being killed. This man was Rhea, who greeted the young master, asking what brought him to his training hall. Jurgen recognized him right away, and the man chuckled, saying it was flattering the young master still knew him. Jurgen agreed and glanced at the sword, alarmed. Then he quickly called for Aaron. He asked if something had occurred between them. Aaron questioned whether he didn't recall. Years ago, when the Marquis forced him to train, the angry young master insulted Rhea by calling him a servant. Rhea swung his sword while laughing, and after that incident, the Marquis stopped making him train. Jurgen yelled that this was terrible. Rhea eyed him sideways, thinking this pathetic waste of space. Jurgen decided he'd escape. He wanted to know if there was another training area since he wished to use one privately. Aaron said this was the fourth hall, but it was extremely far and the equipment was shabby, so it was likely vacant. Jurgen said that's ideal, and he should head there because if he was going to shed weight, he needed to do it right. The bodyguard agreed and told him to follow. She brought him to the fourth training hall, and Jurgen was panting heavily from the walk. He looked down at an equipment table and thought that the Sichuan Tang clan excelled at throwing knives, so he decided he should try aiming at the targets before him. Jurgen aimed at one and raised the dagger to face level. Pulling his arm back, he threw it with full force. But the dagger just bounced off the ground, missing its target completely. He grumbled about thinking he could activate it. But then he realized Aaron was standing behind him. So he made an excuse, claiming he was just messing around. He should develop basic endurance first, and decided he'd jog several laps around the hall. He'd train alone so Aaron could do whatever she wanted. Wellington questioned this, completely astonished because Jurgen had gone to the training grounds and begun working seriously. It was bizarre, and he wondered how long it would continue. 3 weeks went by, and the Lord said that for 3 straight weeks he hadn't stopped training. The young man had dropped considerable weight, and his looks had transformed dramatically. As expected of his son, without all that bulk, he was genuinely attractive. He wondered if he'd actually grown up. In the castle, he thought he'd shed a lot of weight, but the Sichuan Tang clan's technique still wouldn't activate. He'd attempt it for a month, and if it failed, he'd just claim some of the protagonist's hidden opportunities. Aaron suddenly entered saying she brought dinner, and the young man thanked her. It was shireen soup, a nutrient-packed dish, perfect for burning fat and gaining muscle. Jurgen complained about the meal, and Aaron asked if he was sick of it. He confirmed he hadn't eaten anything different for 3 solid weeks, and the girl addressed the young master. She wanted to know what he actually wanted, to lose weight or to become a knight. Jurgen answered he wanted to become a knight, And Aaron said that in this territory, even the mighty Marquis ate Shireen soup after training. So the young master should quit complaining. He should just drink the soup immediately. Jurgen reluctantly followed the orders. He thought he was constantly learning, but he wondered what kind of ancient tradition this was. Anyway, this soup had helped him shed fat, so he'd just consume it for now. He scooped some with a spoon and lifted it to his mouth. Jurgen noticed something unusual and wondered what it was, because today the Shireen soup tasted slightly different. A system window popped up before him, alerting that he'd consumed poison, but another notification appeared right after. He had met the requirement for activating the Sichuan Tang clan skill. This ability had been activated, leaving him completely stunned. Suddenly, the Marquis heard someone knocking at his door and told them to come in. It was his wife who announced she'd brought some tea. Ka, his second wife, asked what he was staring at so closely. Wellington said he was just admiring how lovely the garden looked. Ka mentioned she was personally caring for it with great care, and her husband praised her remarkable skills, but his wife suddenly embraced him, asking when he would name Colin as his heir, as he'd mentioned previously. Since it was already settled anyway, it would be wise to do it soon. Wellington pulled away from the embrace and addressed Ka, warning that it would require a bit more time. Ka asked why, since he'd said he would announce him last month. The Lord confirmed, but she'd likely heard as well. Lately, it seemed Jurgen had finally gotten his act together, and he was the firstborn son of House Rocks. If he genuinely made an effort, he could become a worthy successor. Ka said it was true. She'd heard plenty as well. She was concerned, but he appeared to have improved at least, which must bring relief to her husband. Wellington said it was amusing to think that after getting beaten by his fiancée, he actually straightened out. But Ka questioned what he'd do about the successor. The Lord answered that Jurgen had only been training for 3 weeks and he'd better observe for a while longer, but he promised that if Jurgen returned to his former behavior, he would instantly grant the heir position to Colin. Ka said she'd head to her room first and he should wrap up his work soon. Finally exiting the Duke's room, she bit her lip in frustration. She muttered Jurgen's name and told him to just wait. Back in his room, he was amazed that he'd activated the skill. He then noted that the Sichuan Tang family specialized in poison, and the requirement to activate it was consuming poison. But stopping to consider, he checked the soup's details again. It had an icon, and he wanted to see what was displayed above it. Examining it made the text scroll downward. He noticed it even listed a Haiyangang herb used for paralysis. The young man looked thrilled, and Aaron seemed confused, wanting to know why the young master wasn't eating. Jurgen said he would eat and brought another spoonful to his mouth. As he ate, he pondered a moment longer, wondering who placed the poison in it, since Jurgen typically wasn't harmed by poison. Something had shifted the story's direction, and now that he considered it, something hadn't occurred yet. He recalled his father with Colin. He wondered why his father hadn't officially declared Colin his heir yet, and whether it was because he'd begun training. Regardless, this poison in the meal likely came from that direction. Swallowing the final bite, another system window suddenly appeared before him. It warned that the requirements for the weak paralysis poison had been fulfilled. The young man declared he'd finished eating. This was so delicious it almost made him cry. Aaron was shocked. Jurgen said he wanted some time alone and asked if she could step out. The bodyguard simply nodded. She told him to rest as she'd see him tomorrow, and Jurgen wished her good night. When she exited the room, the young man faced the mirror. He said he'd now examine the Sichuan Tang clan. He commanded the creator's eye to display at once. The system revealed his status and the synchronization rate, which had fallen to 97. Jurgen said it was an intelligent interface, and if he concentrated only on the section with a plus icon, he noticed that he now had poison, martial arts, and hidden weapon skills. First, he decided he'd examine that. Only the weak paralysis skill was activated, but he lacked an internal technique. He said there were numerous poisons, and he should scroll down as much as possible until he found it. The last poison was invisibility. This means he must activate the basic ones first since it's a tiered system. To obtain the most fundamental ability with paralysis, he requires an internal technique. It made sense because the Tong clan of Sichuan used internal energy to hold poisons, and now he'd review the martial arts. There were 3 martial arts choices: the Black Poison Arts, Thunder Needle, and the Divine Energy of 10,000 Poisons. Jurgen said it was an obvious decision, especially for a wuxia fan. The Black Poison martial arts emphasize poison. The Thunder Needle martial art emphasizes hidden weapons. And the Divine Energy of 10,000 Poisons technique takes more time to develop, but it lets him strengthen both his poison and hidden weapons. Selecting that technique instantly, the system channeled energy into him. Jurgen said it was remarkable. The technique's formulas were simply carved into his mind. He had to attempt circulating the energy immediately. Removing his shirt and sitting on the bed, he gathered energy in his dantian. The young man sensed an unusual flow throughout his body. This must be qi. He had to direct it through his meridians and store it in his dantian to develop his internal strength. The following day, the young man finished his meditation. He declared it was amazing. Those martial arts novels weren't exaggerating about training all night without rest. This was real, and he didn't feel exhausted whatsoever. In fact, his body was brimming with energy. He could sense a flow of qi surrounding him. He could detect how many birds were outside the window without even glancing. He also felt a warm energy in his dantian, and now, if he concentrated without a mirror, the status window would display, showing he had 1 star in the technique. He sensed a familiar presence outside the door. He looked there until Erin entered it, addressing her young master as she'd come to rouse him. But since he appeared undisturbed, he must not have slept. Jurgen answered that it simply turned out that way. She responded that it wasn't healthy and he should skip today's training. He refused, saying he was heading out already. He felt fantastic and was in excellent shape, so he had to train. Erin accepted and informed him she'd prepare breakfast first. She exited the room wondering when the young master had begun developing muscles. Outside the training grounds, Jurgen approached the daggers on the table. He whispered, "It's real." As he grabbed a dagger, he readied himself to throw, but then spotted something different. Before his eyes was a crosshair, exactly like in first-person shooter games. So he'd aimed directly at the target. Moving his body swiftly while Erin watched, worried, Jurgen launched the weapon, and it struck the target, releasing a purple glow. He then said he actually did it, and the guard was impressed. He also checked the system's hidden weapons. Erin called out to the young master, asking what he'd just done. He replied that he didn't know either and figured the results of last month's training were beginning to appear. She responded that there was no chance, becoming utterly shocked. Jurgen reflected that it was the first time seeing her like this and wondered if he should attempt again. He gripped the dagger once more. He thought that when he threw at something, it felt as though his internal energy flowed from his dantian, and it was good because this time he'd throw quicker and harder. He threw it again at the target, lodging the dagger deep. The target even broke apart. Erin was completely stunned by this, and he kept a grin on his face. He thought that having precision like a game was essentially using a cheat. Believe it or not, back in the day, there was a first-person game called Battle Attack, and he won the International Championship tournament. Erin questioned what on earth that was. He wanted to know if she sensed anything unusual about him, and the guard repeated her question. She said yes, and aside from the fact that he dropped more weight than yesterday, she couldn't really tell, and he questioned her about losing weight. Erin confirmed it, saying he'd been training daily and drinking shireen soup. But today, he'd transformed more visibly. He was puzzled and wondered if she couldn't sense the internal energy coursing through his body. This meant that in this world, only he could harness internal energy and nobody could perceive it. so he'd gained tremendous power. He chuckled, wondering if he should keep practicing. He struck the target twice consecutively with total ease. He said this time he'd attempt something different. He lodged one dagger into the handle of another. He declared it flawless, astounding his guard once more. She asked if she could try once, holding the dagger and aiming steadily. The girl threw it with full force, but it didn't even reach the target and missed the side. Jurgen said there was something she wasn't able to do, and the girl grew irritated. Then the young man suddenly spotted something. A status window had materialized above her head. She'd activated the direct cut skill. He repeated the part about it being usable with any weapon. He said he'd test it while Erin grew upset because it wasn't working for her. He wondered if he should try with this. He told Erin to step aside for a second. She asked what was in his hand as he was holding a broken wooden sword. He raised it to the highest point, feeling abundant internal energy in his body flowing from his dantian into his arms. Thus, he released it, executing the direct cut. That broken sword buried itself in the center of the target and destroyed everything surrounding it. Erin was amazed and asked what in the world that was, wanting to know what kind of strength the young master possessed. Jurgen replied that he wasn't certain, and maybe it was simply practice. His bodyguard responded that it was impossible for it to be only that. He said he knew about her reporting his training to his father, so he had a request to make. He wanted her to keep this matter private for a while. Erin questioned this, and Jurgen said he was experimenting with many things now and would clarify himself later, so she should be patient. She simply agreed, and thus the day went by. The household staff said goodbye, saying good work, and that they'd see each other tomorrow. The same routine occurred with a man named Peru, who simply acknowledged it. Walking calmly past, he shifted direction. Jurgen watched him with a cold look. Then he decided to use the creator's eye on him. This was Peru with zero affinity, the ability of poisonous touch and agile movement. Jurgen said this power let him slip poison into his food, and it was definitely this guy. So he'd finally conduct the actual test, because the energy hovering in his hand would head straight for this guy. Whispering the activation of the paralytic poison, his aura flowed to his 2 index fingers. Peru felt something odd in his body. He spun around shouting that his body wouldn't move. He approached the paralyzed man saying the test was successful. He could see the total duration was 1 hour and he'd relocate this man first, lifting him onto his back. As night fell elsewhere, Peru struggled. He told him to wake up. He wanted to know if he'd regained awareness and knew who he was. Peru trembled with terror, and he said that if he wanted to survive, he should answer truthfully, asking if it was he who had placed poison in his soup. He had some questions for this man. Peru should blink once if the answer was yes, and twice if it was no. He asked if he understood, and Peru blinked once. He decided to ask again, wanting to know if he was the one who poisoned his soup. Peru looked at him coldly and simply blinked once. Jurgen questioned if the poison given to him was the Hyengang herb. Peru flinched and blinked once more. Moving to the following question, he asked if the one who sent him was Marquise Ka. Jurgen was surprised by the response as Peru had denied it. He told the man not to lie because he could discern everything, and if he lied, he wouldn't survive much longer. Now he'd ask again, wanting to know if Lady Ka gave the command. Peru became even more terrified and denied it once more. He thought he didn't appear to be lying and wanted to know who it was, but he'd pretend for a while, telling him to consume and swallow this because it was called the primal poison. The man swallowed, and he said that from this moment he had precisely 1 month left. If he didn't receive the antidote he held before the month ended, all of his organs would dissolve, and for now it was wiser to obey his commands. He asked if he understood, and Peru agreed. Now he touched his head, attempting to remove the paralysis poison. The man was no longer immobilized. He tells him he can move and talk now, and Peru accepts. Jurgen says he'll ask one final time, wanting to know who dispatched him. Peru shakes slightly in fear, saying it was the Knight Commander, Karak's younger brother. He had commanded that the young master must perish as a warning before the year concludes. He thinks he's Ka's older brother, appointed commander through favoritism, but that wasn't significant. He hands a piece of paper to his new servant. Peru questions if those weren't all poisons. He thinks few people possess knowledge like this guy. He then tells him that someone like him could obtain them on the black market and should take Karak's money. He must gather all the poisons, beginning with the one he already possesses by tomorrow evening. Peru asks why he needs all these poisons. Jurgen replies, asking when he granted him permission to ask questions. The servant merely understands reluctantly. Jurgen turns, saying they should depart quickly. And furthermore, starting today, all his medicinal soups should include plenty of hyangang grass. Peru questions this, completely shocked. Back in his room, he says that was amazing, and martial arts are genuinely powerful beyond belief, and he still fell for his primal poison, where he simply gathered several leaves and Peru trusted it. But regardless, for now, he needs to rapidly master the martial arts of the four heavenly tangs. If things unfolded differently than he wrote, catastrophic events would happen around the world. After a whole day went by, Peru addresses the young master, informing him that he brought all the poisonous herbs he had available. Placing some roots and leaves on the table, he says this was hyangang grass, the reverse green creeper, and the other was a crow inkleaf. Peru is startled, asking how he knew as they were all uncommon toxic herbs. Jurgen replies it was elementary and reflects that he can view all of this with the status window, but he shifts the topic, asking why Peru had the other poisons if hyangang grass would be sufficient to accomplish it. Peru responds that hyangang grass takes considerable time, and if tolerance builds up, anyone can withstand it. If combined with the green creeper, the effects grow more potent. He summarizes that if the poisons are blended, they become stronger and tougher to identify. Wanting to know where Peru studied about poisons, Peru says that when he was 8 years old, he was sold to the living Tyne family and trained under a poison expert. There were roughly 20 children, but all died, and only he lived. Jurgen thinks that without a natural affinity for poison, children wouldn't last long, and Peru doesn't appear thankful to the family. So he'd gained a valuable person, saying he did well, and that was everything for today. Peru thanks the young master and wishes him a peaceful night. He's left alone in the room, thinking it was time to start. With those poisonous herbs there, he'd consume them all, bringing one to his mouth. He feels as though he's going to throw up from the flavor. His system alerts him that all poisons have been consumed and there is severe danger, so he must meditate and advance to level 2. He takes a deep breath, attempting to focus with every ounce of strength. After another day elapsed, Erin knocks on his door, telling her lord that it was already morning. She realizes that the young master had already awakened and is surprised because the young master was sitting on the bed meditating. She questions what on earth had occurred to his body. He manages to achieve 2 stars and obtains the draconic treasure martial art and 3 additional poisons. He then wakes with a smile on his face. She asks what on earth happened to the young master, but then catches a strange smell and complains about it. He just scratches his head and accepts it. It made sense, really. When internal energy and martial arts advance a level, the body purges tons of impurities. He walks over to the window, mentioning the stench and saying he should air out the room. Erin quickly stops him and insists he head straight to the bath instead. As the day goes on, she leads the way. Jurgen laughs to himself, practicing the movements of the draconic steps martial art, an optimized movement and evasion technique used by the Tang family. He can hardly believe he's learning something straight out of a novel. For now, he'll just mimic the movements. Erin calls out to him and turns around, asking why he's suddenly walking like a drunk and if something's wrong with his body. He waves it off, telling her he's fine and not to worry. She watches him sway side to side, looking unconvinced, and asks if he's really okay. After all, they're going to Training Hall 1 today, and there'll be plenty of knights around. He assures her he'll be perfectly fine. He's just curious to see how the other knights train. Nothing to stress about. Erin mentions they're almost there. The knights are training hard, swinging their swords up and down, side to side. One knight looks surprised and asks who that person is, noting the woman is the eldest young master's attendant. But who's that handsome guy following her? People are stunned, remembering how the young master shed massive amounts of weight from training. What kind of magic did he use to go from nobody to this? Jurgen thinks to himself that it doesn't matter if they whisper. His internal energy lets him hear every word anyway. Aaron points out a guy in the courtyard who's deeply focused on his training. He looks like a knight apprentice, but his form is excellent. He'll probably make novice soon. These are the basic movements of Rock's fencing, so the young master should pay attention. Jurgen notices him right away. That's Clyde, a major character in the novel who becomes the protagonist's ally. He'd never actually written Clyde's backstory before he was found by the hero. Clyde swings his sword downward, and Jurgen finds it interesting to see him in a place like this. An opportunity will come along eventually. For today, though, these knights with their negative affinity toward him will serve as perfect test subjects. First up, he'll test N-Chain. He picks a purple-haired knight as his target and activates it. The knight feels it instantly and drops to his knees. Other knights rush over, asking what's wrong and if he needs the bathroom. The man refuses through gritted teeth, drool sliding down his chin as he tries to endure the agony. He collapses completely, and the knights shout to call a priest. Then, just as suddenly, the pain vanishes. His superior asks what's going on. The pain's gone? Was he joking around? Go use the bathroom if you need to. The knight tries to explain he was genuinely in pain. Jurgen notes it worked well. This time he'll try Soul Disintegration Mist, which causes fear and confusion in targets within range. Suddenly, a knight gasps. The man in front of him has transformed into a terrifying demon. Aaron sees several men on the ground screaming for the demon to go away. She wonders what's gotten into them. In the nightmare, the man faces demons and skeletons trying to kill him as he curses his fate. But then it all disappears without warning. They look around confused, asking what just happened. Jurgen thinks he can't let them catch on. That's enough testing for one day. Pretty impressive results. He announces he's heading back. Aaron asks if he's leaving already. He says it's too loud here, and he'll go to Hall 4 like he planned. On the way, he runs into a maid who tells him a visitor has arrived for the young master. Miss Ilya and the Marquis have come to see him. The woman by the window mutters that this time she'll truly break Jurgen's stubbornness. She turns toward him, and he simply says her name. A girl nearby suddenly blushes. Jurgen asks if she's arrived already. Ilya doesn't recognize him and asks who he is. Back in the room, he tells her it's him, Jurgen. The girl looks surprised, and he says it's been a while. Ilya mentions she heard the rumor about him losing weight from training, but assumed it was obviously fake since it hadn't even been 2 months and he'd changed so dramatically. He explains it's because he worked hard, which leaves Ilya confused. After getting beaten, Jurgen thought for a long time. Then he decided to turn his life around. Ilya asks if he wants to fight back for revenge, but he refuses. Instead, he kneels down, grateful to her because she helped him come to his senses, and he's truly sorry for what happened. He tells her he'll accept it if she wants to break off their engagement because of everything. She simply asks who he is. She doesn't recognize him at all. Jurgen replies that he's the former waste of the Rocks family. Again, he apologizes deeply for everything he's done. Ilya looks surprised by this. He thinks that honestly, it wasn't his fault, but the original owner of this body's. The reason he's asking for forgiveness is specific, though. Ilya isn't just some simple heroine. She has the Sword Queen ability, which only amplifies her swordsmanship even more. Later on, she'll save the struggling protagonist and even defeat the final villain, all thanks to her power. That's why even if the engagement gets broken, it'd be smart to repair their relationship and make her his ally. But Ilya tells him to stand up, asking if he's serious about this. Jurgen says yes and promises, but she refuses to accept just words. She demands he swear on it, all while giving off a terrifying aura. He thinks the pressure is suffocating. He's seen this scene somewhere before. Ilya warns him she doesn't want him living like he did before, and if he breaks the agreement, she'll beat him senseless. He's confused because the original Ilya had said this to the protagonist in his novel. Either way, he can barely breathe and mutters about the divine energy of myriad poisons. Ilya looks surprised as he manages to stand up. She questions how he resisted her aura, but he accepts and swears to it with a warm smile on his face. Ilya gets embarrassed and turns to leave, saying she'll be watching him. If he screws up one more time, they'll break the engagement no matter the reason. He's surprised they haven't ended it yet. At the Lord's castle, Wellington asks if she found Jurgen, and the girl confirms. He questions if she's made her decision. Ilya confirms once more. The engagement won't be broken, no matter what. Wellington asks for her reasoning. Ilya explains that her father always said people can't change, but there was a rumor that he had changed, and she was curious. She'd been wondering if he'd returned to being the weak but kind Jurgen from their childhood. Instead, he'd become a completely different person, which is why she wanted to believe in him just this once. Wellington asks if that's all, and the girl confirms. But if he goes back to being a loser, she'll beat him until he's had enough. Wellington says that's exactly what he'd expect from a great warrior, and she should look after Jurgen. Ilya decides to head out, but the Lord asks her to stay a few more days. The girl mentions she told her father she'd break the engagement, which makes things a bit awkward. Wellington asks if she'll see Jurgen before leaving, but Ilya refuses, saying he's training and she doesn't want to interrupt him. The day passes and Jurgen wonders why his father called for him. He shakes his head, asking who someone is, and he doesn't understand the question. Wellington chuckles, saying it was a joke and that Jurgen has truly worked hard, but he wants to know if Jurgen knows why he's been summoned. Jurgen asks if it's about starting his night training. Wellington confirms he's right and has gotten sharper too. Now he'll learn the Rock's family swordsmanship, he declared. But then Jurgen speaks up, saying he has something to tell the Marquise. His father asks about throwing techniques. Does Jurgen want to learn that instead of swordsmanship? He confirms, and Wellington replies that's unacceptable. Those crude skills are used by bandits. With that technique, he wouldn't even get close to earning a knight's armor or taking down a low-level monster like a Borak. Jurgen then suggests they make a bet on whether he can hunt a Borak with a dagger. If Wellington is so confident, they should wager on it. His father calls him unnecessarily stubborn. A warrior's blade needs aura to break through a Borak's scales. Unless you've practiced throwing for 100 years, you'll never pierce a Borak's hide. Jurgen says in that case, his father must be certain of victory. So make a bet with him. His father calls him reckless and says he'll take this opportunity to completely crush his stubbornness. He asks what the victory conditions are. Jurgen replies that if he defeats a Borak with his dagger, he'll manage his own training. If he fails, he'll do whatever his father commands. As the day passes, he's glad Aaron hasn't reported the details of his training. The real test comes tomorrow. He wonders how many attempts it'll take to pierce a Borak's scales. Just in case, he'll eat some poisonous herbs tonight and raise his divine energy of myriad poisons to 3 stars. He turns when he hears a sound. Aaron calls out to the young master, announcing she's there to deliver the Marquise's message. Tomorrow at noon, the location will be the first training center. He asks if even she knows about the bet. Aaron replies that not only her, but the entire estate is already aware. Thanks to that, the whole place is bursting with laughter. Everyone's talking about how the young master will wet his pants in fear or run away when he sees the Borak, having a great time discussing it. After all, the young master remains public enemy number 1. Jurgen says in that case, all these people will be watching tomorrow. Aaron confirms, saying the Marquise won't stop there and the training center will be packed. He grumbles that it's the price of fame, but asks what Aaron thinks will happen. The girl says it'll probably be the young master's day to shine. His divine energy of myriad poisons technique reached 3 stars, and the great moment of the test arrived. The crowd cheers, shouting either against or in favor of the young master. Jurgen says it's truly embarrassing. His father starts the event by asking if his son is ready. He confirms, but mentions there's a massive audience. Wellington says he only told his wizard, but somehow the news spread to everyone. Try not to be ashamed of it. The wizard announces he'll begin and use his low-range summoning magic. Jurgen thinks he's finally going to see magic with his own eyes. A lightning bolt suddenly strikes the battlefield with a creature taking shape amid the smoke. He thinks there's something even more incredible than that, seeing a monster he created as an author right in front of him. A borak, a sea monster standing 5 feet tall. People think they shouldn't look at it. It's terrifying. He's impressed. This is exactly how it looked. This monster, the borak, was something that came to his mind while he was eating sea urchin sushi and was packed with ideas for creatures. If not for its legs and arms, it would even be kind of cute. The monster charges toward him. Jurgen simply notices the attack and dodges, moving to the creature's back. People look impressed, and the Lord says it's not over yet. The borak turns around, completely bewildered. He thinks it just charged without thinking, but it's not as fast as he imagined. First, he'll test how tough its scales are by drawing a dagger. Then he spots something different. There's a target-like mark indicating a weak point on the creature. The protagonist decided to test his arm by throwing the dagger. He poured his energy into the blade, hitting the creature right where it was vulnerable. The borak suddenly cried out in pain and collapsed, ruined before it could entertain the crowd any longer. The protagonist muttered in disappointment. It went down in a single strike. Everyone watching was amazed, and Lord Wellington stood there in complete disbelief. The crowd erupted, cheering that the young master had actually pulled it off. He'd taken down the boraks, and it was incredible. They clapped wildly until someone yelled, "Unbelievable!" Another voice demanded to know how he'd managed that. The protagonist simply said he'd aimed with care and struck the right place. His father protested. He refused to believe a borax could fall to an ordinary dagger. It just wasn't possible. The protagonist shot back, asking if the great Marquis Rox intended to break his word. The wizard spoke up, explaining that beneath the borax's arm was an unprotected patch of skin, and the young master had hit it perfectly. Wellington grumbled that it was nothing but dumb luck, but the protagonist reminded him a deal was a deal. His father asked for one more round, offering to sweeten the pot. If he won, the protagonist would get anything he wanted, but if he lost, he'd return to proper sword training as promised. The protagonist perked up at that. His father announced the next opponent would be a knight, not a borax, and asked if he'd still take the challenge. The protagonist agreed without hesitation. In fact, he thought this worked perfectly. He'd be facing Karos, the commander of the knights. Maybe this was his shot at humbling that arrogant bastard. Still, he wanted to keep Peruse's weakness in reserve, so he'd hold off for now. Wellington pointed out that a fully trained knight would overpower him easily, so he'd substitute an apprentice instead to make it fair. The protagonist considered this, then asked if he could pick his opponent. He chose Clyde. The man stepped into the arena with his sword strapped to his back. He said the Marquis had summoned him, and Wellington noted he looked pretty sure of himself. He told Clyde he had a job to do. The apprentice nodded, saying he'd follow any order from his lord. Wellington told him to put the boy in his place, and Clyde turned toward him. The young master just waved casually, leaving the fencing apprentice completely confused. Wellington asked what the problem was. Wasn't he confident? Clyde quickly denied any doubt, insisting he'd do as commanded. The protagonist told him to relax. He'd only throw 3 daggers, and if Clyde blocked them all, he'd win. Wellington scoffed at the boy's cockiness and demanded Clyde teach him a proper lesson. Clyde raised his sword, and the protagonist began circling the arena. The other knights teased him, saying if he lost, he'd skip dinner and run 100 laps around the training grounds. A soft voice from the crowd encouraged the young master. He figured whoever that was, at least someone had his back. Clyde announced he was ready, and the protagonist turned to face him. He readied his first dagger, planning to start by testing the waters, but then he noticed something odd. Compared to fighting the borax, Clyde had way more exposed spots. If he landed a clean hit on any of those, it'd be over. He couldn't allow that, so he threw his first dagger. He'd go straight for it. Clyde called it out and moved to block with his sword. The force drove him back 4 full steps. People gasped, asking what that noise was. It sounded like a cannon going off. Wellington told him to hold on and spotted the dagger on the ground. He picked it up, baffled at how an ordinary blade could carry that kind of power. Clyde stood there, shaking, his sword now cracked clean through. The protagonist asked if he was warmed up yet. He'd seen what happens when you let your guard slip. He warned him to get ready, because this time he'd throw with everything he had. The pressure he gave off made the apprentice knight visibly tremble. The protagonist realized that even after everything, Clyde was still a main character. He wouldn't go down this easily. The protagonist figured it was time, readying his dagger for a direct hit. That massive blast rang out again, rushing toward the knight. Clyde swung his longsword to counter, but a deafening crash shook the entire arena. As the dust settled, everyone stared in shock. The Marquis couldn't process what he was seeing. Clyde had dropped to his knees, trembling in fear, his sword shattered in 2. He let the pieces fall, leaving Marcus Wellington completely stunned. He called out to the protagonist, saying they needed to talk privately. The protagonist reminded him the match wasn't finished yet. 1 dagger remained. The Marquis questioned why, since this was clearly enough, but the protagonist said he'd ask Clyde himself. He told Clyde to look up. Clyde called out to his young master. The protagonist asked if he'd really end things like this, and whether someone hoping to become a knight would accept such shame. Win or lose, he should keep fighting until there was a real conclusion. That's what a knight does. He shouted one more time, asking if Clyde was really going to quit now. The knight muttered something, then called out to the young master and demanded someone bring him a fresh sword. Standing tall and radiating energy, he declared he wouldn't give up this way. The knights gasped, and the Marquis wondered how a novice could awaken his aura like that. Just as expected at this stage, Clyde's berserker trait kicked in. Now the protagonist could try some higher-level moves. The two stared each other down for several seconds. Clyde told the young master to throw his dagger. Wellington thought to himself in denial. For such an aura to appear meant talent on par with a senior knight. He wondered what the protagonist would do next. The protagonist simply said it was perfect. Taking his last dagger and channeling all his power into it, he threw it in a strangely clumsy way toward Clyde. Clyde wondered what that was. Why was it so slow this time? He yelled that the protagonist was mocking him and swung to cut the dagger down, but it curved right past his blade. He stood there confused, and Wellington caught on immediately. The dagger had lodged itself in Clyde's side, nearly reaching bone, and the knight cried out in agony as he hit the ground. People muttered in confusion. It had been so slow. Was Clyde overreacting? Maybe he was going easy since it was the young master. The protagonist figured there must have been more internal force packed into it this time, causing severe pain. His father called to him, saying they'd discuss things later, but he'd won the bet today. The protagonist smiled. Clyde clutched the wound on his shoulder, but the protagonist touched him and told him to hold still. He used energy absorption, and Clyde felt the pain vanish. He thanked the young master, and the protagonist brushed it off. The knight apologized, explaining that at first, when the dagger came at him so slowly, he thought the young master was looking down on him. But that wasn't it at all. It was a refined technique. Not even a master could learn something like that so quickly, which meant he must have been hiding his real abilities. He asked if some hidden faction was targeting the Marquis family, and if that's why he'd concealed his strength until now. That would explain why only the young master had been left behind. It was a noble sacrifice. The protagonist thought this guy always jumped to wild conclusions. Meanwhile, Clyde said the young master had shown impressive determination in fighting this secret group, and if he ever needed help, he should just call on him. The protagonist wondered when his approval rating had shot up so high, so he agreed, saying they'd meet again soon. He thought Clyde was just a straightforward berserker with a good heart. Clyde told him to count on him. He'd spread the word that the young master was never worthless and make sure everyone heard about it. Staying close to Clyde could prove useful, since one day he'd be able to handle missions on his own, and that would definitely come in handy. Aaron said the young master had done well, and he thanked her. She brought up his final move, saying she'd never witnessed anything like it before. The protagonist explained it was a brand new skill and asked what she made of it. Aaron admitted that as she watched, she wondered how she would have fared against him without having seen it first. But now she felt confident she could defend against it. The protagonist thought she wasn't just talking big. Among her talents, she had the clear mind mirror ability, which was exceptionally rare and valuable. He replied that she'd been training as a knight since childhood, and if she hadn't dropped her guard back then, she'd already be one. He asked if she was content with how things turned out. Aaron didn't get why he was suddenly asking that. As evening arrived, Wellington relaxed in his office. The protagonist walked in, asking why the Marquise wanted to see him. His father said when it's just the two of them, he could call him father. All this formality was ruining the moment. The protagonist simply agreed, still a bit thrown off. His father asked what exactly that move from yesterday was, because even after going through countless books, he'd never come across such an odd technique. He'd only trained for a month, and no matter how gifted someone might be, inventing a skill from scratch was out of the question. He demanded answers and told him to be honest. The protagonist knew he couldn't reveal the truth, but he had a good backup story ready. He announced he'd discovered a book, and his father asked about it. The young man confirmed it, explaining that while browsing the estate library for training manuals, he'd found a book lying around. Wondering who'd left it on the floor, he leaned against the wall to rest. Suddenly, a book tumbled down from the dusty top shelf. It had no title on the cover, just an odd symbol carved into it. The protagonist didn't think twice and opened it. A bright light burst out, planting something straight into his mind. Then, the book disappeared entirely. Wellington realized this was a magic tome. The protagonist nodded. He explained that a magic tome was a self-sustaining artifact containing a great mage's power, designed to transfer their knowledge. The Lord said that's how magic tomes functioned, and even though he didn't know the details, it might have been brought back by their ancestors. Finding this book was incredibly fortunate for him. The protagonist decided he'd treat this as a lucky break. His father stood up, saying a deal was a deal, and he'd no longer force him to study swordsmanship. As an extra reward for keeping his word, he should name what he wanted. The protagonist calmly addressed his father. He said he'd like the position of heir, which left Wellington stunned. However, if he did that, his father couldn't promise anything. Wellington thought it over and said that with his authority, he could make it happen. The protagonist asked why he looked so troubled, because if he became successor, it would create issues. Many would push back against the Marquis house, especially the young lady, which would stir up serious chaos. So, this time, he'd compromise instead. His father asked what he meant, but quickly accepted and thanked him. The protagonist explained his reasoning. If he became the successor, he'd be trapped with the Marquis all day getting lessons on running the estate. Instead, he wanted time to sharpen his abilities in the four skies of the Tang clan and explore the world to find new chances. Wellington told him to ask for something else, and the protagonist said he wanted to create his own knight order. He wanted Aaron, currently his attendant, and Clyde, who'd faced him earlier, as his two knights. His father replied that wasn't as complicated as the heir position, and Aaron was also a valuable asset, so keeping her as an attendant would be wasteful. He should go ahead with it, and the protagonist simply thanked him. The Lord asked about his attendant, since there weren't many staff left at the moment. The protagonist mentioned there was someone named Peruse working in the kitchen, and he wanted him as his new attendant, but he'd appreciate it if the Marquis took responsibility for giving him this opportunity. Wellington asked if something was going on, and the protagonist said he'd explain later. His father simply agreed with a sigh. The protagonist figured his father seemed to trust him and didn't bother with follow-up questions. Then again, he had no clue how his approval had climbed so high, maybe just because he was his son. Outside, the protagonist announced that starting today, the two of them were members of his personal night order. For now, they needed to focus hard on training during combat drills. He also welcomed their new attendant, Peruse, who simply asked them to look after him. Aaron stood quietly, recalling a question she'd had for the young master the day before. She'd wanted to know why he'd replace her with someone named Peruse as attendant. The protagonist scratched his head and admitted Peruse was a spy sent by Commander Karos of the White Eagle and Miss Kasha. Aaron said that even if that was true, she couldn't feel safe having him so close as an attendant. The protagonist assured her that Peruse now only followed his commands. Clyde told the young master he had something to ask. The protagonist said that was fine and encouraged him to speak. The aspiring knight pointed out that even with just the two of them, it was already a night order, but it should have a captain or leader. Normally, the leader was whoever had the best skills, but Aaron was small and delicate and didn't seem all that strong, so he should be the captain. The protagonist agreed. The strongest knight should lead. So, from now on, the two of them should spar. Only seconds later, Clyde surrendered with Aaron's sword at his throat. She said his moves were way too predictable and needed serious work before he could hold his own. Clyde accepted it, saying he'd remember that advice. The protagonist simply nodded and declared that with this, the leader of the Night Order was officially Aaron, and he clapped for her along with Peruse. Peruse announced he'd start preparing dinner, and the day went on. The young man figured he was far enough away but could still sense energy, so he decided to test his new technique, using internal force instead of voice to generate sound waves and send them into people's minds, a method often seen in martial arts stories. He then mentally called for Peru. Peruse responded to the young master and turned around but realized he wasn't anywhere nearby. The protagonist repeated his name several more times, leaving his attendant totally confused and spooked. The protagonist asked why he looked so shocked, and Peruse complained he was losing his mind, demanding to know if this was some kind of dark magic. The protagonist explained it was a communication method. Peruse muttered that just as he suspected, he wasn't only affected by the poison. He'd heard that dark mages could wield both, so the young master must be something like that. The protagonist felt baffled and told him to believe whatever he wanted. He asked if the poison he'd requested last time was finished, and Peruse confirmed it. Serpent's thought a poison distilled from 100 venomous snakes was ready. The protagonist told him to make absolutely sure to add plenty of poison to the celebration soup. Peruse shuddered in fear at the order but accepted, saying he understood. The next day, the protagonist opened his eyes after meditation. He let out a deep breath, thinking he was still stuck at 3 stars, and his internal energy wasn't increasing like he'd hoped. He didn't know how much time remained until the world's crisis hit, so he had no choice but to leave the Marquise's territory for now. He went to his father's study and announced he was planning to head out. Wellington questioned him about this. It had been a while since he'd gone anywhere, so he must be thinking of some town within the Marquisate. The protagonist confirmed it, and his father asked how many days he'd be gone. The protagonist figured he'd travel far but didn't need to reveal that, so he said he was thinking about a week. His father said he understood, since he'd been training intensely, and asked who he wanted as an escort. The protagonist replied he didn't particularly need one, leaving the lord taken aback. He told his son to remember his position. He was the eldest son of Marquis Rox. The protagonist countered that he was just going to a nearby town, so having an escort seemed excessive. Wellington shouted that he still didn't grasp how harsh the world could be, and while he might have gotten stronger through training, poison was a real danger. The protagonist thought poisons wouldn't affect him anyway, but it looked like convincing this man would be tough, so he said he'd do as asked. His father then asked when he'd leave. The protagonist answered in about 2 days, and Wellington said he'd arrange the escort by then. The protagonist figured an escort would be pointless since he planned to slip out tomorrow. As evening arrived that day, the protagonist summoned Peruse to his room. He told Peruse he was going on a trip but didn't have any money and needed him to bring some. Peruse must have the funds Kairos gave him for buying expensive potions. He asked if Peruse was planning to keep it for himself. Peruse quickly denied it, saying it would be an honor to provide it. The protagonist asked if he had anything else too, because he'd noticed Peruse had a subspace pouch when he brought poisonous herbs before. This was a typical item in fantasy tales that could easily store about a ton. Peruse said he'd hand it over to the young master, though very grudgingly. The protagonist accepted it and thanked him, noting he wouldn't need a backpack now. Still, he told him to take something in return, his fake remedy. He explained it was a month's supply of antidote for his poison. The protagonist added that since Peruse was performing well, he was counting on him going forward, and if he kept it up, he'd give him the full cure soon. That left Peruse visibly excited. The next day, just before sunrise, the protagonist knew he had to sneak out since he was supposed to wait for an escort. He slipped through the estate with complete ease. The young man thought that, as expected, no one was around. A gardener spotted the young master and greeted him, remarking he'd gotten up unusually early today. The protagonist just acknowledged him. He sensed a surprising amount of power coming from this friendly-looking gardener and decided to use his insight ability, but he was shocked by what he saw. For the rest of the day, the protagonist noted this was his first time leaving the Marquis Castle since arriving there. He noticed something different: the magic tower. A mage at a desk spotted the young man and asked how he could assist. The protagonist said he'd like to use the portal. The mage asked if he'd used it before, and the protagonist said no. The young receptionist explained they had a rewards program, and the protagonist thought it was just like airlines. The mage asked for his destination. The protagonist replied, Asu Castle. The receptionist remarked it was quite a distance and understood. The fee would be 50 gold. After paying, he'd need to sign the travel document. The protagonist thought it was pricey as expected, but at least Peruse had plenty of cash. For now, he used an alias, Polo, the one he'd used in games. The mage told him to follow along. He was directed to enter the chamber. When he heard a knock, it would signal he'd reached his destination. The protagonist stepped inside, thinking it was quite an elegant setup. Suddenly, lightning crackled at the tower's peak. The protagonist didn't understand, but someone announced he'd arrived and could step out, welcoming him to Asu Castle. The protagonist wondered how he was already there since he hadn't felt anything. The mage explained that portal travel was seamless, a point of pride for mages. The protagonist pondered this sensation. He wondered if he'd written such a smooth experience into his story, but the mage encouraged the customer to use their services again and wished him a safe journey. The doors swung open, and the protagonist came face to face with an entirely new setting. This was Asu Castle. Probably because it was an eastern territory unlike the Marquis domain, the building styles were different. Plus, there were tons of people everywhere. First, he'd locate the blacksmith district, asking a local for directions. He followed a route to a modest shop in an alley. The protagonist reflected that he'd been searching for a while but couldn't locate the unicorn blacksmith. The sky was already getting dark. This was the final spot he needed to check before nightfall. A sword rested on an anvil, and a blacksmith hammered it into shape. The protagonist called out, asking if anyone was around. The blacksmith noticed the new visitor, and the protagonist confirmed he was there but had a question for the blacksmiths in the area. He wanted to know if the blacksmith knew someone called the Unicorn Blacksmith. The man said he didn't know any blacksmith by that name nearby. The protagonist wondered if he'd ended up in the wrong spot, but the blacksmith added, "Though that's the name I'm planning to use for my shop pretty soon." The protagonist activated his insight skill on him, reading that his name was Juranox, and he had the gift of forging demonic weapons. The protagonist realized he'd found exactly who he was looking for. He asked if he could check out the weapons for sale. The blacksmith gestured for him to head that direction and browse. The protagonist scanned all the weapons and armor displayed on the wall. He asked how business was going, and the blacksmith looked puzzled. He explained that since his shop was tucked away at the end of the alley and his skills weren't outstanding, even when customers showed up occasionally, they usually just glanced around and left. He wasn't sure how much longer he could stay open. The protagonist thought it was fascinating. The gear there was seriously impressive. He saw the Wind Spirit Rapier, which boosted attack and movement speed, and also the Flame Spirit Longsword, which enhanced strength and endurance. He then asked if Juranox had crafted them himself. Juranox confirmed he had, but when he finished them, they ended up as total disasters. Once completed, the swords became unreasonably heavy. Even a powerful man couldn't lift them, so nobody wanted to purchase those weapons. The protagonist figured it was because unworthy hands had tried to wield them. If the right person held them, the sword's true strength would emerge. He still didn't fully grasp how it worked, so he announced he'd take both swords. Juranox pointed out they were flawed pieces, but the protagonist said they were ideal gifts for Aaron and Clyde. He thought to himself it wasn't the treasure he'd come for. Still, he asked if Juranox had any really rusty weapons lying around. The man looked confused. The protagonist then noticed a crate filled with old tools. The blacksmith said it was odd for him to want rusted weapons. He'd just set those aside to sell off later. Those things wouldn't get used anyway. The protagonist reached into the crate, saying this was precisely what he'd pictured. Juranox spotted the weapon and mentioned he'd made it. It was already sitting in storage when he took over the shop. He had no clue where it originated from. He'd thought about tossing it as scrap, but decided to keep it. The protagonist said he wanted the dagger as well. Juranox seemed taken aback. He said since the protagonist only picked defective items, he'd only charge 2 gold and the dagger would be thrown in for free. The protagonist thought this was an absolute steal. If the real power of these weapons were exposed, he couldn't get them for under 200 gold. But beyond that, it was the blacksmith himself he really wanted. So he pointed out that Juranox's business wasn't thriving and offered to have him close the shop to become his personal blacksmith. Juranox said it was extremely sudden, and he didn't know what to say. He wasn't opposed to shutting down, but it felt too rushed. The protagonist decided he'd introduce himself properly first. He was the invincible spear guarding the south, Urin Roxas of House Roxas. Juranox was stunned to hear the Marquise's young master's name. He immediately dropped to his knees, begging for forgiveness as he never dreamed someone of that status would visit such a modest place. The protagonist told him to get up. Juranox replied there was no need. It was more comfortable this way, and he could speak openly. The protagonist accepted it but still urged him to stand, thinking he couldn't shake the feudal mentality. Juranox asked why he'd want to hire a struggling blacksmith like himself. The protagonist answered it was because of his unique talent. The blacksmith insisted he had no such thing. His master had drilled him relentlessly every single day. The protagonist figured he must have been trained in a harsh military-style method. He then explained that he'd stopped by many forges today and examined all kinds of weapons. But Juranox's work was different. He poured great care and effort into them. His swords were expertly made, and the grips especially were carefully designed, which was crucial to keep the sword from slipping during combat. Seeing his commitment, he believed Juranox would eventually unlock a truly remarkable ability. The protagonist wondered if he could actually convince him to join. Juranox replied he'd serve the young master, but he really wasn't like the rumors suggested. The protagonist asked if that was about him being worthless. Anyway, he'd show the blacksmith something interesting. He pressed his fingertip against the dagger. Then he told it to awaken with his blood, for it was Ain's relic of 1,000 shapes. The weapon started to hover and drifted out of the protagonist's grasp. The blacksmith wondered what that was. It looked like a legendary sentient sword. The protagonist thought that originally it was the main character who was meant to claim it. The system asked if he wanted to form an exclusive bond with Ayan, and the young man went ahead with it. The spirit took on a different shape with an unusual kind of voice. It demanded what the hell this was and who he thought he was to make a pact with it. He didn't have any talent anyway. The protagonist figured it was let down not to sense mana coming from him, but its manner of speaking was incredibly cocky. The sword grumbled this was irritating. A guy like him actually wanted a contract. Anyway, how did he know its awakening phrase? The protagonist answered he'd learned it from a great prophet, thinking he'd just invented that to keep his story believable. Ain questioned how the great prophet had spoken to someone like him, and anyway, he must know about its powers. The protagonist confirmed N was adaptive gear that could divide into a main and secondary form, able to change into any shape the user envisioned. In the original tale, the hero used a sword and shield. Even if the secondary weapon was dropped, it just came back to the main form. N said he probably didn't know how to use it since it could only be controlled with mana. He should give up because of that. The protagonist watched quietly. He remarked that it was the chatty type. Pointing at the weapon, he thought he could wear it like a ring. Ayan protested it was burning and felt like it was dissolving, while the protagonist realized internal energy worked fine with mana. Either way, he called for Juranox, asking how long he needed to wrap things up here. The blacksmith said 2 days would be plenty. In 2 days at sunset, the protagonist arranged to meet him in the castle's main square. On his way there, he recognized a voice. Ilya asked what this was and why he was there, leaving the protagonist puzzled. The protagonist had the same question, thinking the scene near the main square felt oddly familiar. It was the exact location where the original hero first encountered Ilya. The girl asked what was up with him, and the young man apologized, realizing the original story had shifted. Ilya climbed down from her horse, repeating her question about why he was there. The protagonist said he was searching for a blacksmith. She found that strange, since there were plenty within the Roxas family. The protagonist explained he wanted to hire someone on his own. The girl said if he'd mentioned it sooner, she would have assisted, but the protagonist had already found a capable person who was coming now. Juranox called out to the young master, asking if he'd been waiting long. The protagonist said no, he'd arrived right on time. He was introducing his fiancée Ilya when someone cut in, calling for the team leader. They were about to head out and wanted to know who this person was. Ilya addressed Musk and introduced her fiancé from House Roxas. The man echoed the name with alarm in his voice. He said it was remarkable to encounter a member of the Marquis Roxas family in a place like this. Identifying himself as the commander of the Marquis family's 5th Night Division, Musk Malone was his name. The protagonist said it was nice to meet him. He thought to himself that he already knew plenty without Musk's full introduction. To put it bluntly, Musk was a forgettable side character with a dull personality. As Musk and his knights were advancing, children got in their way. The protagonist stepped in, and a scuffle erupted. Ilya showed up just in time, shutting everything down, and that's how their relationship started. But the crucial part of this was that the protagonist joins Ilya in combat and rescues her from a life-threatening situation. But he couldn't just track down the protagonist again, so he had no other option. He couldn't allow her to die. He called out to the girl and asked where she was headed. Ilya explained that because of the rising orc activity around Asu Castle, her knights had been ordered to eliminate them. The protagonist said he had a request given the circumstances. He wanted to come along, and Ilya asked why. The protagonist explained that as someone still learning, he needed real battle experience and wanted to put his abilities to the test. Ilya pointed out it could be risky, but the protagonist simply agreed, saying he was skilled at escaping. The girl paused to consider. She agreed and told Sir Musk to get him a horse. He tried to protest they weren't going on some leisure ride, and even with the orcs involved, they couldn't afford mistakes, especially since he sensed no mana from the protagonist and had no reason or interest in protecting anyone. Ilya addressed Sir Musk again, stating it was a direct command and he should stop complaining and just follow orders. Musk muttered his compliance, saying he'd handle the preparations, and if it was an order, he'd simply obey, clearly radiating hostile energy as he glanced back. The protagonist and Ilya stared at each other without speaking. As the day wore on, she mentioned it was dangerous and her fiancé should stick nearby. The protagonist simply acknowledged this. He told Jurinox to hang on tight, and Jurinox accepted the young master's instruction. With that, the troops started moving forward. In the region ahead, Ilya announced they'd now split into teams of 5 to locate the orc settlement. They shouldn't engage first, but return and send a signal if they found it. Then they'd regroup, and she'd take that route with her squad. They pushed ahead, and the day stretched into nightfall. A soldier remarked the trails were extremely distant and difficult to spot. It was getting late, and he wanted to know their next move. Ilya said for now they had no choice but to head back. But a sudden sound swept across the group. It was a flare, and there was another one from a different direction, repeating in multiple locations. Ilya asked how many they'd spotted now, totaling 5. But the protagonist thought it was 4, and he hadn't kept count. The leader decided to check the northwest area first, so they began riding that way. Ilya noticed something upon getting close. All her soldiers were dead. The members of her team were horrified. Even the armor had melted, and they wondered what had struck them. Ilya ordered them to press forward toward the flare from the south, so they rode in that direction with extreme urgency. She saw the same thing when they arrived there. All her soldiers were dead. Her companion urged they should hurry to the next spot, but the protagonist interrupted, saying they couldn't go right now. Ilya questioned this and called her husband's name. The protagonist warned that the orcs were picking off the soldiers individually, and at this stage they stood no chance of winning. They needed to halt the mission and fire a flare to rally their forces here. Her soldier snapped at him to be quiet, insisting he knew nothing about moving troops in such a setup. He blamed everything going wrong on a punk like him. The protagonist recalled that in the original tale, the hero was also blamed. He was slammed by readers for making them suffer through it, and now he was dealing with lingering stress from that. Musk claimed the protagonist knew nothing about warfare, but the protagonist told him to shut his mouth, leaving the soldier utterly stunned. He suddenly dropped to the ground in pain, but Ilya denied this was happening. She called to her fiancé while he commanded the subordinate to remember his rank. Musk understood and pleaded for mercy while the protagonist just observed. He turned to Ilya, remembering that in the original story, she ignored the hero and got lost in her own thoughts. The protagonist told her to decide for herself, asking if now was really the moment for hesitation. Ilya admitted that, as he'd said, if she'd failed to assess the situation clearly, they should immediately send the blue flare to gather the troops there. The signal shot into the sky shortly after, visible throughout the forest. The protagonist rested with the group. Jurinox said the young master was amazing. He'd made the call according to his judgment, and the protagonist replied it was nothing. The blacksmith said the soldiers would meet up with them, but the protagonist said perhaps most of them wouldn't make it back. He thought to himself it was because of that bastard Karuta dealing with them. Jurinox called to the young master, asking what he was waiting for. The protagonist answered it was a genuine fight. A subordinate sprinted in that direction and shouted to the squad leader, telling her to escape because they needed to leave immediately. Ilya questioned this and raised her sword toward a disturbance. A massive horde of orcs marched toward them, an overwhelmingly large force. Musk complained it was an absurd number of creatures. Ilya looked stunned and apologized to the protagonist, feeling it was her mistake that got them into this mess. The protagonist replied it was okay. They wouldn't lose their lives here, he promised her. She asked what her fiancé would do. He summoned An and said they'd test what they'd practiced these past 2 days, using the duplicate form to create black iron pellets. The 3-star technique he'd gained from the weapon but hadn't had a chance to try was the black iron blast. Then he hurled the pellet toward them, radiating tremendous energy. The sphere simply struck the orcs' axes, and they began to laugh until an explosion erupted and consumed the entire zone. The numbers dropped dramatically from just the protagonist's attack. He waved his hand, making the black iron blast come back, thinking that Ain's power worked perfectly with his abilities. The remaining orcs decided to charge the young man, but he just launched the sphere again, triggering another huge explosion across the area. Ilya wondered what he'd thrown. The protagonist said they were black iron orbs, and he'd explain properly later. Still, the orc count had dropped considerably. Ilya demanded to know what her troops were doing. They could win now. This was their opening, and they should finish off the remaining orcs. Advancing on the creatures, Ilya managed to isolate one of them. Her subordinates, with serious effort, managed to strike another. One of the watching orcs looked shocked, but then came face to face with a reddish figure. This time, glancing up in terror, the figure then grabbed his head with its hand. Ilya and her troops suddenly spun around. She wondered what this thing was. It was an insane size, and that creature had just crushed the orc. The protagonist thought it had finally shown up. That was Karuta, the legendary orc champion. If they didn't stop this monster today, everyone would die. Karuta let out a roar that tormented everyone in the vicinity. Steadying his sword against a surface, he lunged toward Ilya. The girl yelled she had to evade, but her husband grabbed her back, asking why she was frozen there. He yanked her clear of the attack's strike zone. He said they'd nearly died just then. Ilya gasped, seeing her subordinates dead. Karuta roared, glaring at the protagonist. The protagonist simply threw a black iron blast at him. It flew toward the monster's throat, then exploded like a bomb. But Karuta stayed unharmed and roared once more. He muttered something as he walked toward the protagonists. The protagonist wondered if it wasn't effective. Its frame was that of an orc warrior, and its hide was as tough as steel. Ilya cursed the creature, demanding how he dared slaughter her subordinates like this. She channeled her blade aura, swearing she wouldn't let this pass. Then she charged with her technique at blistering speed. Her sword met the orc champion's weapon evenly. They traded several strikes, but Karuta stayed firm, simply blocking everything. The subordinates cheered for their squad leader, saying she was truly impressive. The protagonist thought that, as expected from Ilya, her sword empress trait was overpowered. But it was still early in the novel, and to think she was powerful enough to pressure Karuta this far, even slicing through his armor and flesh. The monster raged, truly injured for the first time, catching the girl's focus. He let out a roar and unleashed his aura, and Ilya wondered how he was capable of that. Karuta glanced sideways and swiftly swung his blade, forcing Ilya to defend. Just like in the original tale, Ilya was beaten by Karuta. The soldiers rushed to assist their squad leader. Ilya said it was humiliating, but she couldn't defeat this beast. They needed to run to stay alive, but the protagonist stepped to the front of the battlefield. The orc called out to the protagonist in its guttural language. Meanwhile, the protagonist simply gripped his dagger, getting ready to throw it. He launched his direct strike at the creature. Karuta easily knocked the attack aside. The protagonist thought the dagger thrown with a direct strike was destroyed with a casual swipe, just as he'd anticipated. The monster roared again, trying to communicate with the protagonist, but then looked bewildered, noticing something on its armor's shoulder plate. There were fragments of the black iron blast causing a massive chain reaction. Karuta was injured by the hit, leaving his right arm useless. The protagonist realized the first one he'd thrown was a decoy. Karuta had been too focused on blocking the direct strike to catch the one trailing behind. Its hide might be like steel, but apparently its whole body wasn't. Its vulnerable spot was still the gap in its armor, so he couldn't just aim randomly there. The creature trembled in fear before the protagonist's tactics. It then rushed at him with raw instinct. It attempted a wide slash, but the protagonist managed to evade. The monster tried to land several more strikes but kept missing. The protagonist shifted his dagger, asking what it planned to do. Right then, another explosion struck the creature. The protagonist said it was only scared of this, but he had no plans to let it catch him easily. The orc turned to look at Uranox, then started walking toward the man while the protagonist shouted not to. Karuta leaped toward the blacksmith. The protagonist cursed the situation and released his internal energy. He had to rescue him somehow. He channeled as much internal power as he could into his dragon stride technique. The monster tried to crush the blacksmith, but the protagonist intercepted with speed that left afterimages. That impact hammered the ground hard and Karuta spun around. Ilya said it was impossible. That speed just now was unbelievable. The protagonist decided to finish the fight now and called for Anne. One of the supreme hidden weapons of the four skies of the Tang clan was the crimson butterfly. He then hurled it at the orc using a curving throw. The butterfly drifted slowly toward the orc and moved elegantly and smoothly. Ilya called it a gorgeous attack while the orc shook in terror. It tried to swat the butterfly away with its blade, but it avoided every strike until the butterfly slipped through its guard and touched its chest, making the orc shriek like never before in its existence, triggering a final detonation. The protagonist watched, slightly anxious, and Ilya was stunned. The protagonist wasn't certain, but with that much force packed into the crimson butterfly, it was more than sufficient to pierce the orc champion. It was truly devastating. Musk said it collapsed and they'd won the battle. Ilya turned, saying it wasn't finished yet. There were still smaller orcs left. She commanded her troops to eliminate them. Jurinox thanked the young master for rescuing him, and the protagonist reflected that his first real combat had ended safely. That night at the army camp, the protagonist asked Ilya if she was injured. She replied she was fine, but since she owed him, she couldn't grumble. The protagonist said it was okay if they helped each other, and it was natural given what she'd asked earlier. He didn't train in swordsmanship, but in hidden weapons, leaving the girl confused. The protagonist confirmed it. The explosive orb and the butterfly at the end were his hidden tools. She found it hard to believe. It was incredibly strong. The protagonist figured it was tough for her to grasp. He was certain she'd spent her entire life believing the sword was the ultimate weapon, but her perspective had just widened. A knight informed the captain he'd prepared a storage pouch. Ilya accepted, saying they might not locate all the bodies now, but they should at least collect the leader. She drove her sword into Karuta's corpse. She stood up, noting that its size was massive. If they tried to stuff it directly into the storage pouch, it wouldn't fit. Ilya said it was fine. They were made for protection, so they shouldn't feel guilty. But since night was approaching, they should head back now. They then rode on horseback as Musk met the captain. She asked where he'd been. The signal had gone up ages ago. The man looked puzzled and explained they were ambushed by orcs far off and were held up because of the fighting. Ilya understood but wanted to know where the others were, since only 2 came back. Musk replied they'd been killed and the orcs were tougher than anticipated. But the captain demanded to see the bodies and ordered them brought to her while the knight tried to shift the topic. He walked toward her as Ilya kept issuing commands. Then he said he'd explain their starting positions first until he quietly pulled a dagger to try and strike Ilya. But the protagonist stepped in. Musk hit the ground. The protagonist pointed out he claimed to be battling orcs, but there wasn't a single trace of green blood on him. He was obviously working with the creatures, feeding them intel from the beginning. Musk asked how he figured it out. Ilya drew her sword, saying that explained everything. The man tried to argue the Malone family had served the Marquise family faithfully, but she simply brushed it off as meaningless. She told him to stop resisting. And so, the night carried on. At the noble estate in Asu Castle, Jurinox woke the young master, calling him several times. The protagonist sat up, asking what he wanted. The blacksmith said it was nearly noon. Also, Captain Ilya was there to see him. The girl appeared wearing a black gown, asking if her fiancé had rested well. The protagonist was completely thrown off. He asked what was up with that outfit. Ilya replied that the protagonist should visit her home. Her father had ordered her to bring him, and she asked if he'd come. The protagonist thought that up close. Calling her the most stunning woman alive wasn't overdoing it, and he said he absolutely would. Ilya said she'd wait for him outside and he should get ready to go. The protagonist started thinking a bit. He noticed her approval had only risen since he'd helped her once. Outside, the protagonist called to Ilya and apologized for keeping her. The people around glorified the ironclad knight, Lady Ilya, who alone defeated the orc champion, and the honor was hers. The protagonist thought this title was given to her because she refused to surrender even facing death. It was identical to the novel. People also yelled that he was Lord Euron, the Steel Mage, and that he was strikingly good-looking. The protagonist felt confused by this, thinking these nicknames came from soldier accounts. He figured they saw him controlling metal spheres and assumed he was a mage, while Ilya suddenly addressed him. She said she'd brought it up before, but she was extremely thankful for being rescued twice. The protagonist said she didn't need to bring it up. It was only natural. The girl announced that at sunrise she'd gone to the forest to recover the bodies from that awful battlefield. It was devastating to see all of them scattered through the forest. Then she understood something. If it hadn't been for him yesterday, they would have met the same fate. The protagonist glanced down thoughtfully. Ilya declared she'd train harder and grow stronger. She'd surpass everyone without exception and never lose again, while the protagonist thought she'd truly awakened her potential. The mages readied the portal to the Marquise territory. Ilya explained that since it wasn't distant, her father sent family mages. They should head through quickly, meeting at the portal's center. Those mages started channeling, and the teleportation spell was cast. The protagonist and Jurinox were amazed by this. Ilya mentioned it had been some time since he'd last come to her estate. The protagonist thought the surroundings changed in an instant, feeling slightly lightheaded. Jurinox wondered if every noble family had such enormous residences. Either way, it seemed the protagonist had been invited for a meal. In the original tale, the hero only ate the Marquise estate's special soup every day, but today, he'd finally try authentic noble food. The Marquis welcomed his son-in-law, telling him. The protagonist tried to bow, but the Marquis told him to simply sit, as no ceremony was required. The young man just accepted and took a seat across from Ilya. The Marquis said he should first thank him, because before being his fiancée, she was his daughter, and he was grateful for him saving Ilya's life. The protagonist said it was nothing special, just what he had to do. Then the meal was delivered to them. The protagonist waited eagerly for it to be unveiled. That was the Marquise family's signature soup. The Marquise explained that similar to the Rox family, they had their own secret recipe, and their custom was to eat soup after combat. So, please, he should enjoy it. And the protagonist thanked him for the meal, trying to convince himself he could handle it. Suddenly, as they ate, the Marquis asked when they intended to wed. The protagonist looked puzzled, and the Marquis clarified he meant his daughter. The protagonist figured it must be a challenge. The Marquis likely disliked him since his approval was -10 even after rescuing his daughter. So he answered he'd marry right now if possible, and Ilya was flustered by this. The protagonist continued that he wasn't the family heir, and his troubled history made people look down on him. To be deserving of Ilya, he'd transform himself, and once he became heir, he'd take her as his wife. The Marquis questioned if he thought this was achievable, as he'd heard his younger brother was regarded as a prodigy. Did he truly believe he could overtake him and become heir? The protagonist replied he was definitely capable. The Marquis laughed, saying he'd genuinely changed, just as the rumors suggested, and he'd back him. But he shifted topics, mentioning that before the protagonist arrived, a message came from Wellington. His arrival had already reached the Rox family, and someone notified him through magical communication. The protagonist asked what his father said, and the Marquis replied they should communicate after the meal. The protagonist simply thanked him and glanced at Ilya as she ate, wondering why she seemed upset again. Regardless, it appeared he'd managed to make a favorable impression on the Marquis. In another chamber, the communication started. A mage brought the crystal to the Rox household, then began displaying the Lord's image. The protagonist thought it was like a projector or video chat. The young man addressed his father and asked for forgiveness, while his father cursed at the brat, but then asked if he'd been injured anywhere, and the protagonist said no. Wellington immediately changed subjects, wanting to confirm if it was accurate that he'd saved Ilya and defeated an orc champion. The protagonist replied he'd just gotten a little lucky. His father understood, saying he'd hear the full story upon his return and wanted to know when he'd come home. The protagonist decided he'd return the day after tomorrow. His father warned him to bring his brother when he came, leaving the young man startled. The Marquis said the protagonist would depart early tomorrow, but it would be nice if he stayed a few more days, and the protagonist replied he'd like to. However, his father had assigned him a responsibility. The Marquis said that was unfortunate, but he'd arrange a magical portal so he could journey comfortably. The protagonist sighed slightly, but decided to decline no matter how appreciative he was. He was at a stage where he needed to sharpen his abilities through personal effort, and it would be better not to grow soft with a teleport. The Marquis said he'd truly transformed into someone else. He was eager to see how powerful the protagonist would become, and the protagonist thanked him. Ilya smiled at that answer, and the protagonist figured she must have appreciated it. Outside, the protagonist thought he had a motive not to use the Marquis family's teleport. Juranox noted the route to the capital was in the opposite direction, and the protagonist had mentioned they'd go there. The protagonist announced they needed to make a stop somewhere before that, the massive mountain beside the Marquis' estate, known as the Dragon's Rest. Juranox questioned this, saying he wanted to visit there before heading to the forge. He asked if the young master would also make a prayer, but the protagonist said no. Instead, he'd claim a treasure, thinking it was something the original hero would discover later. They kept walking through that location. The cavern called the Dragon's Rest was the dwelling of the species in ancient eras. His companion remarked it was still early, but there were plenty of people. He asked if there'd really be a treasure there, but the protagonist said it was a myth, and the world was packed with mysteries, so Juranox should follow him. As they headed toward the mountain's base, Juranox agreed. They walked, and the blacksmith panted heavily, commenting there was nothing visible. The protagonist wondered if this was it, the entrance he'd designed in the shape of a dragon's mouth. He glanced around, checking if anyone was close by. The protagonist decided he'd just open the dragon's jaw. They were stunned when the opening suddenly took form and swung open sideways. Juranox said this was completely impossible, but the protagonist decided they'd simply go in. They stepped inside until the stone sealed shut again. The blacksmith noted it was brighter than he'd imagined in there. Seeing it was a crystal, the protagonist warned him not to touch it, as a trap would trigger. Juranox asked what sort of trap it was, but the protagonist explained the whole chamber would likely turn into a blazing inferno. There were numerous traps scattered around, so Juranox should stick close to him, and the blacksmith simply agreed. They approached an altar and faced it. Juranox said it was remarkable, but there was nothing on the surface. The protagonist asked if Juranox knew what was concealed behind it. Since the fake Dragon's Rest ended there, and beyond that barrier, he sensed the presence of people. Right now, they were worshipping near them. The protagonist decided they'd check out the treasure anyway, pressing the lever under the altar. An opening appeared, and Juranox said it was unbelievable. All of it was 3 sacks of gold coins. The protagonist picked up a container, thinking this was more precious than the coins. It was the warrior's jade with a rebirth property, crucial for growing stronger. They headed out, and Juranox asked where they should go next. The protagonist answered the magic tower in Asu Castle. The blacksmith mentioned that even at this time, lots of people were still praying out front. Then the young man detected a serene energy and intensity. He used his insight ability on that woman, but nothing occurred, and the protagonist realized she only showed up later in the story. Juranox wondered what that was. The protagonist questioned how her aura was so intense. She was someone he couldn't beat right now.